Starting with next Sunday, Palm Sunday, the Sunday of the Passion, we will enter 8 days at the center of Christian ritual, Christian belief, Christian life, really. The remembrance of the time between the triumphal entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem, through his Last Supper with the apostles, his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and the awareness of the resurrection that followed from the discovery of the empty tomb on Easter morning. Year after year, we tell the same story. We see the same actors, and we're called to reflect on how this all relates to our lives. And all that's important. It's what tradition has to offer, a dependable framework, a defining myth for meaning that we rehearse, that we remember, that we incorporate year after year. But before we get into that deep, familiar flow, I want us to stop a bit, stand back a bit, turn off the automatic pilot and look around and see if we may be missing something. Something may be hiding in plain sight that we don't see, don't notice, because we're not really looking for it. I don't know what that might be. I just think we ought to look. Last week, for example, I talked about conscience. But the Old Testament lesson had that strange story about Moses making a bronze snake and putting it on his staff or on a pole, so people could look at it and be cured of snakebite poisoning. And then in the gospel reading, John associated Moses lifting up the snake with Jesus being lifted up on the cross. That was pretty strange. I put it on the bulletin cover, but I don't know. What was that about? And then today we have Melchizedek. Melchizedek, whose name means, or seems to mean, righteous king or king of righteousness. It's been interpreted in many ways, said to be the king of Salem, which could be Jerusalem, could be king of Jerusalem, could be king of peace. He appears 3 times in the Bible. In Genesis, where he meets and blesses Abraham. In Psalm 110, and in the passage from the letter to the Hebrews that we have for today's epistle reading, that basically quotes Psalm 110. His appearance with Abraham in Genesis seems to interrupt the flow of the narrative within that chapter, so a lot of scholars who have looked at it think that this was some kind of addition put in there for some reason, or that part of the story maybe fell out. Both the reference in the Psalm and in the letter to the Hebrews assume that we know what they're talking about when they say the order of Melchizedek, but I don't think we do. And in spite of the lack of clarity here, or maybe actually because of it, there is a lot of speculation about Melchizedek in the Jewish and Christian literature, especially in some of the Gnostic or more mystical writings. Even the Book of Mormon and the Theosophists, the people that built McGowan House, mention Melchizedek in their various stories. He's one of those figures that are really tailor-made for the projection of our fantasies, about wisdom. He's kind of a wise old man, archetypal figure. Fantasies about power, about possibility. They show up. They're clearly important, but then they just vanish. They're outside the story, but still somehow they seem to be meaningful if we could just understand the meaning. Melchizedek in that way is like the Muslim figure known as Khidr, who was said to be the wise wanderer referred to in the Quran as a teacher of Moses. And there's an interesting passage about Khidr and Moses there. He too was a figure from outside the tradition, outside the main storyline, but apparently was worth telling about, worth Gabriel telling Muhammad about, close to God, it seems, in ways that aren't really made clear. And there are echoes of this same theme in Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha. That was one of the seminal inspirations for my getting interested in religion, where the main character is around at the time that the Buddha is teaching, and he even hears one of the Buddha's sermons, but then goes his own way. And there's also some similarity, I suppose, to the Dudley Moore comedy Holy Moses. Has anybody seen that? I don't think it's got a lot of stars. Where Moore's character Herschel is sitting just around the bend from Moses on the mountain of the burning bush and mistakenly thinks God's talking to him, and it proceeds from there. There's Monty Python's Life of Brian, where Brian is born in the stable right next door to where Jesus is born, and he gets proclaimed as Messiah in spite of his bewildered protests. But with the serious Melchizedek and Khidr versions, these characters remind us that, as Bob Dylan would later point out, you know something's happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? So we all have stories that we tell about our lives. Last week I told a story about when I got caught stealing something in 5th grade. And I have stories about the summer after 8th grade when I grew 3 inches and lost 5 pounds and learned to play bridge and started smoking and started reading books on my own. The first book that I read on my own was Kafka's short stories. I got into soul music and I found a steady girlfriend. I have stories about my year in India, about seminary, about the year that I took away from seminary when I was reconsidering it all and washing dishes at the Robin Hood room at the mall in Iowa City, and then going home in the afternoon and watching the Watergate hearings. I have stories about getting married, adopting my children, getting divorced, living in the cabin, meeting Molly, going in and out and back in favor with the church, coming to St. James, stories of trips and traumas, and you've heard most of them a couple times, probably. I generally use the same words every time I tell them, too. But it's like, how sometimes you're not really sure you really remember something, or you've just seen a picture of it, or somebody else has described it to you. It may very well be that the only way we do really remember things is by putting them into a kind of story. And the story's true, but might not be complete. May have been changed, may have been edited somehow, that we aren't really aware of. Dreams, I've heard, may actually occur as associated but all mixed up images that we only put together into some kind of order when we wake up. So we can tell the story and then remember them. Or actually, I guess, misremember them, sort of. And we think of our life in the same way, as a chronologically ordered progression where one thing happens at a time, but it may not really be like that. Or that may not be the whole story. Just like Melchizedek popping up and then vanishing, there may be some really significant parts of our lives that we're just not aware of because they don't fit the story. I had my tonsils taken out when I was 4, as a story, and mostly I remember the strangely pleasant smell of the ether, which probably should have told me something, and the feel in my throat, the cool feel in my throat of the raspberry sherbet when I ate it, and the light from the window next to my crib. I was in the corner by a wall and a window. But I also remember that in the next crib, or I remember slats, there was a kid who was having an ear built. He'd been born without one of his external ears, and they were doing a series of plastic surgeries to build his ear. And my mother was fascinated by that, and that's what she mostly talked about. So maybe that memory of the kid in the next crib may be her story rather than my own. But also the fact of her attention on him instead of on me may have had some kind of lasting impact on my life that I'm not aware of. And suppose that while I was sleeping once, she sang to that kid, and he grew up and became a musician sort of because of that, and moved to New York and was down on his luck, and turned out to be the guy who asked me for a subway token after the Young Rascals concert at Holman Memorial Skating Rink in 1965. That part did happen. I don't know who it was, but he asked me for a subway token, and when I gave him a subway token, he said, "Oh, no, I don't want that." And so I said, oh, and I gave him $5, and he said, "Oh, wow, angels are made from people like you." That's the only time I've been an angel. Maybe. And maybe meeting that guy who was there because my mother sang to him, maybe, had me miss my train to where I was living in the Bronx, so I didn't get mugged and disabled on my way walking from the subway station to the apartment. Or maybe I missed meeting the girl of my dreams on the train. That's my story. That's a story. How the $5 influenced that guy is his story. We don't know. We don't know. Melchizedek may be waiting just down the street to give us his blessing. Or he may give it to us silently as we pass by and we just feel a little something. Or we may miss it. We may miss the blessing because we're focused on our email, looking it up on our phone as we hurry to our next appointment. Ultimately, see, really, it's not about our story. It's God's story about us that carries the meaning of our lives. We're just living it out. For the Jewish tradition, Melchizedek is a figure from the outside. He's a passing reference. He's peripheral to the plot that centers on the chosen people. And for me, the guy in Central Park is from the outside, whether or not he was the same kid in the crib. He's peripheral to the story of my life as I tell it to myself. But for God, there is no periphery. God is the center and the circumference of everything that is. It's all equally central, equally important. It's not a story at all. Reality is not a story, but an abundant overflowing of being and inundation of love into creation in all its aspects. Sometimes we take ourselves way too seriously, both the good and the bad, thinking, it's our burning bush, or the gifts that those wise men bring have been chosen especially for us. Or sometimes we can neglect, dismiss the importance, the deep, universal significance of each moment of our lives as an indelible aspect of reality forever. The wandering mystic king of peace who shows up from nowhere just for us, just at the right time. It's miraculous. Those who love their life, Jesus said, or at least cling to it too tightly, will lose it, may miss it. Those who hate their life in this world, or at least are willing to take it with a fairly large grain of salt, will keep it for eternity. Thanks be to God.